My name is John Finn and I'm a researcher at the Teagasc Environment Research Centre at Johnstown Castle in Wexford. I'm a farmland ecologist and I work on biodiversity as well as the science of multi-species swards. So today I briefly want to present some of our preliminary work, and it is very preliminary, on the development of an indicator that will help us to incorporate biodiversity into the Teagasc National Farm Survey. I often think of environmental sustainability as a three-legged stool, with each of the three legs of the stool representing climate and greenhouse gases, water and biodiversity. And despite biodiversity being a key metric and obviously upholding the stool as one of those three legs, it's usually a blind spot in terms of measurement and how it contributes to quantitative measurement of environmental sustainability. For several years, biodiversity has been acknowledged as a key omission in the Teagasc National Farm Survey. And again, today, I just want to show some preliminary work on how we're working to try and develop an indicator that could be appropriate and incorporated into the National Farm Survey. So this is an example of a farm habitat report from a previous Teagasc project, indicating on the left here a farm habitat map with a very large area of wet heathland and other types of heathland, some peatland on this farm and a lot of wet grassland. A table here beside that map has the habitat codes and the area and a brief indication of the relative ecological value of each of these habitats that occurred on the farm. So what we're interested in is developing a habitat index that could use this information, the area of each of the habitats, its relative ecological value, and use this information to develop a habitat index that is weighted by the area of each of the habitats and their relative ecological value. And a contrasting example would be this more intensive dairy platform, which is a lot lower area of ecological habitats of high value, although it still does have about 10% of the farm area of habitats of one sort or another. And what we see is a need to develop an approach that can help differentiate this level of habitat occurrence on farms to better inform our ability to track what is happening in the countryside in terms of biodiversity. So this work was made possible by an award from the EU Smart Agri-Hubs project, which is investigating the use of technology to improve the practice of agriculture. So we were looking at how could we use these technological approaches to improve the reporting of biodiversity and the assessment of biodiversity and the production of farm habitat reports. So this was conducted on 300, which is a subset of the total National Farm Survey farms, and it was a collaboration between Teagasc, Code Plus and FAIRS. Our starting point with this approach was to take all of the habitats that we found on the farmland and categorise them according to an ecological value that varied from 1 to 5. So as an example of the habitat categories, in the lowest category of 1, this included buildings, improved grassland, arable land, coniferous forestry. And at the highest level, we see habitats such as peatlands, lakes, rivers, turlochs and native woodlands. And of course, there was a range of habitats in between with values 2, 3, 4 and 5. And this really is the essence of a habitat index score, where a farm with a score of 1 would be completely dominated by habitats that have a habit category value equal to 1, whereas a farm with a habitat index score of 5 would be completely dominated by habitats with these scores of 5 here. But of course, you could have anything in between depending on the area dominated by the types of habitats of value 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5. So this approach allowed us to broadly discriminate between farms along this habitat index spectrum from 1, as you can see this top example here, which is a platform dominated by intensively managed grasslands, quite large fields and relatively few hedgerows, in contrast to a farm on the bottom, which is dominated by peatland, woodland and other grassland areas. So just want to present a few examples of the types of farmland that corresponded to different levels of the index value. So with an index value of 1.04, here's one example. Again, very intensively managed grassland area with the hedgerows indicated as the yellow lines, bringing the score up from being a base rate of 1. Here's another example. And then moving up through the values, we see another farm here with a lot more of less intensively managed grasslands, bringing the score up to 2. Another example here of a farm with an intensive platform, but a lot of adjoining areas with coniferous forestry, but also native woodland and deciduous woodland, again bringing that score up to 2.02 in this case. Moving on to another example here, it was the highest scoring value across the whole data set with 4.8. And again, this area dominated by habitat mosaics of heathland, peatland, woodland, and so on. And final example with a habitat score or an index value of 3.9. We see here another farm with a lowland area of intensive grassland, but also this very large area in a karst landscape that again pushes the index value up to 3.9 for this particular farm. So in this example, I've taken the whole set of 300 farms and split those farms that occurred in the dairy, cattle, sheep, and tillage enterprises. And I've taken the whole area across all of the dairy farms and presented it as what proportion of that area is dominated by the habitats with an ecological value of 1, habitats with an ecological value of 2, the proportion with 3, 4, and 5, and so on for each of the 4 categories here. So you can see quite a lot of variation amongst them, especially in the proportion of area with the higher habitat ecological classes. So again, quite low. So as we go from 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, you can see the differences between that and cattle here, which had quite a spike in the habitats with ecological value 4, and sheep, which had the highest proportion of habitats with the ecological value of 5. I have to stress, this is very preliminary data and a very preliminary assessment. The data only arrived about in the middle of November. So this is a very preliminary approach, but it gives us a broad breakdown of the kind of information coming back from this set. So for each of the 4 different enterprises here, it comprises of a varying number of farms, and each of those farms is associated with an index score. So what I'm doing here is just presenting a box plot and a distribution of those scores for each of the enterprises. And you can see that they vary across the enterprises, but also even within each enterprise, there's quite a lot of variation and quite a distribution of scores, anywhere from 1 right up to this maximum value here of about 4.8. So what do we conclude from this work? First of all, it is capable of differentiating broad habitat types and farmland with broad habitat types. There's a very important caveat here, which is that we have no insight into the quality of the habitats that are occurring on the ground. We are only able to measure their quantity, but this is work that we could conduct in follow-up surveys. There is a lot of added value in conducting this approach on the National Farm Survey dataset as opposed to other farms. Because they are a nationally representative set of farms, this really extends the power of extrapolating from this to other farmland, for the farmland that this set represents. Probably more important than looking at the change or the differences amongst different enterprises, we can track change over time, especially at a time when there's expected to be a further increase in policy objectives for biodiversity and expenditure on that. It allows us to connect this biodiversity metric with other National Farm Survey data, including the economic, agricultural, and social indicators. And the old adage, you can't manage what you can't measure, also is another reason why this needs to be included more formally in all of our sustainability measurements. Recognising that the Teagasc National Farm Survey isn't representative of all farmland in Ireland, for example, it's more representative of the more economically active farms. Teagasc has a supplementary small farm survey, and we would expect that that would show a much higher level of public good provision that's not as adequately credited as it should be, and would also probably score a lot higher on this kind of a farm habitat index approach than we see in this current set. So we'd see that as being quite important as a future target to implement this approach on the small farm survey. The imminent release of the National Habitat Map means that this would provide a lot of the core data that would make this approach a lot more feasible and a lot more cost effective, and hopefully more feasible to track over time as well. And finally, at European level, we see that the Farm Accountancy Data Network is about to transition to the Farm Sustainability Data Network, again to reflect the increasing importance of sustainability objectives at the higher level objectives of the CAP. And we expect that this will further increase the need for biodiversity metrics of some form to be incorporated into these kinds of EU level and national level assessments. Okay, thank you.